The number 7 best chess game of the 1950s is Botvinnik vs. Smyslov from 1954. Now, in the 1950s, 3 of the 4 World Chess Championship matches that were played were between Botvinnik and Smyslov. In 1954, the year of this match, the match was ultimately drawn, allowing the reigning champion Botvinnik to retain the title. In 1957, Smyslov won fairly convincingly to become champion, and then in 1958, Botvinnik was guaranteed a rematch, another stupid rule, and he fairly convincingly won that to regain the title. Across the 3 World Chess Championship matches, this game is probably the most famous. It vividly demonstrates Smyslov's smooth quality of play and excellent piece coordination. The game begins with an opening that was all the rage in the 1950s, the King's Indian defense. On the white side, Botvinnik selects the fianchetto variation against the King's Indian. Now, Botvinnik had a lot of success in his career with fianchetto systems, for example, the Botvinnik system in the English opening. However, his record against the King's Indian defense in particular was more mixed. He ultimately loses this game spectacularly, and in 1960, in his World Championship match against Mikhail Tal, he lost what was my best game of the 1960s. To be fair though, in both cases, Botvinnik did get a sizable opening advantage, but the play was very sharp and very tactical, and that did not suit Botvinnik's style. After pawn g3, both players are developing without a lot of initial conflict in the middle of the board that is typical of mutual fianchetto systems. But here we do get that conflict after the break pawn to e5, the traditional King's Indian break. To prevent further expansion with pawn to e4, we see Botvinnik now commit in the center with pawn to e4, gaining space. Pawn c6, bishop e3, knight g4, tickling this bishop, and that bishop expands further to g5. Now, the modern line is simply pawn to f6, and black seems to get a good game, but in this game, Smyslov goes queen to b6. Now, historically, we can understand this move particularly by understanding that in the 1950s, the games that were making the King's Indian defense popular and played at all levels were games in which queen b6 was being played. For example, Bronstein won 2 brilliant victories in which he played queen b6, put pressure on d4, put pressure against b2, and created some fantastic tactics to win the game. This move also works spectacularly in this game, but there is basically an opening refutation which Botvinnik could have used to get a sizable advantage. Now, first, Botvinnik starts with pawn to h3, trying to push the knight back to a bad square. Smyslov, of course, isn't intending to fall back like that, so he includes the move pawn takes d4, opening up this bishop right here and giving his knights more squares in the middle of the board, and good dark square control. But after pawn takes d4, what about knight a4? The attacked knight on c3 moves, attacking the queen on b6, and on the next turn, white is going to capture on g4. Isn't white going to just win a piece? Well, only temporarily, because after queen a6, pawn takes g4, Smyslov has prepared pawn to b5. The knight on the edge of the board is surprisingly trapped, so Smyslov is regaining his piece. But is he getting a good game out of it? Well, not if Botvinnik finds the best continuation. That is the move bishop e7, attacking the rook on f8, attacking the pawn on d6. Now, yes, black is getting the piece back, but in this position, after the strong move pawn c5, and there are other good candidate moves as well, this bishop is very powerful here on d6. White has a lot of control and space in this position. The pawn on d4 is likely to fall, and ultimately, white has a significant advantage in this game. This is why players today do not play this way. In the game, though, Botvinnik goes for knight takes d4. He's prepared some tactics, but they are going to backfire. After pawn takes a4, Botvinnik's prepared move is knight takes c6, initiating a ton of complications. Now, this is by no means a losing move yet, but I think that the trend of the game is now in Smyslov's favor. More and more of the lines favor him, and it's harder and harder for Botvinnik to find the moves that will lead to equality. So, queen takes c6 and pawn to e5. This is Botvinnik's idea, skewering the queen and the rook and winning the rook on a8. So Botvinnik is going to win material here, but he's disorganizing his pieces to do it, and Smyslov is going to get really good counterplay along the long diagonal. So first, queen takes c4, bishop takes a8, knight takes e5, At this point, Smyslov has one pawn for the exchange, and pressure here against g4, pressure here against pawns on the queen side, like this b2 pawn. Black is doing very, very well. There's a ton of activity for Black in this game. So now rook c1 attacking the queen. The queen goes to b4 over here, attacking the pawn on b2, a3, and Smyslov just snaps that pawn up on b2. Botvinnik goes for queen takes a4, and in this position, there is one best move. I encourage you to pause your video and try to figure out what Smyslov played and be sure to anticipate Botvinnik's response. For the moment, Botvinnik has control of the long diagonal with his bishop on a8. Smyslov would like control of the long diagonal. That's why he plays the brilliant move bishop to b7. Now he does have to anticipate Botvinnik's response, but he's got everything covered, and really this is an outstanding move. The idea is so strong that at this point Botvinnik really needs to settle back, control things, and he can achieve a draw by giving back material by first trading on b7, and then after queen takes b7, getting ready to give up a rook for the knight that is about to hop into f3 with check. The critical move is rook c3. After Botvinnik gives up an exchange for the knight on f3, the game is actually going to trickle out to equality, and he will have escaped Smyslov's damaging intentions. However, in the game, he does not escape. He goes for the very tempting move rook to b1, hitting the queen here on b2 and lining up against the bishop on b7. At this point, it really looks like Botvinnik is just winning material and maybe the game. Of course, it is not so, and Smyslov is prepared for this line. After rook b1, he starts with knight f3 check. Now, probably the better move was to move the king up to g2 so that you could later block a check with pawn to f3. But Botvinnik does go for king h1, and there's not a huge difference between the different king moves. Now, at this point, we get bishop takes a8, giving up the queen on b2, a beautiful queen sacrifice about which Smyslov says, Black gets 3 minor pieces for his queen. This would normally be an advantage, but here it is absolutely decisive on account of the open position of the white king. Of course, Smyslov is 100% correct. The further 10 moves of the game only illustrate the helplessness of Botvinnik in this position. Now, Botvinnik no longer has a choice. He must take on b2, and it's nice to pause here to count the material because at this moment, and this moment only, Botvinnik is up basically a rook and a bishop. However, they fall in the next 2 moves. We get knight takes g5 with check, and now after king h2, knight f3 check, and then king h3, there is bishop takes b2, regaining what is sort of material equality. Again, 3 minor pieces for the queen, but these 3 minor pieces are monstrous. The king's position is a disaster, and the 3 minor pieces are going to coordinate so well that there will never be a chance for this rook to get active. Meanwhile, as soon as Black's rook enters the game, the position will be decisive. So at this point, we see queen takes a7. There's really only one hope for Botvinnik. It is somehow queening this pawn down here on the a file. Of course, that is never going to happen, but you might as well try it. So now bishop to e4, moving that bishop, pawn to a4, king to g7, so patient. And now after rook d1, bishop to e5, we see queen e7, rook c8. The rook is headed into c2, targeting f2, and that's really going to be game over. Pawn to a5, rook to c2, king g2, knight d4 check, king f1. There are many ways to win at this point, but bishop f3, rook b1, and knight to c6. Now, this hits the queen and the pawn on a5. Capturing the pawn on a5 would be enough, but probably the best idea for Smyslov next is bishop to d4, targeting the pawn on f2. After it falls, this will basically just be a mating attack that finishes the game. Therefore, Botvinnik resigned after knight to c6. I hope that you've enjoyed this beautiful game, the wonderful piece coordination from Smyslov. If you want to see more of my best games of the 1950s, then simply click on the playlist that is popping up on your screen as I speak.